The rhythm of the North Sea is a heavy, rhythmic heartbeat, a constant pulse of cold grey water that has defined the edges of northern Europe for thousands of years. If you were to stand today on the salt-sprayed cliffs of Norfolk or the windswept dunes of the Jutland Peninsula, you would see nothing but an endless, churning expanse of slate-coloured waves meeting a heavy sky. It is a restless place, known for its sudden gales and the way the mist clings to the surface of the swells like a shroud. To the modern eye, this sea is a barrier, a vast, watery void that separates the British Isles from the rest of the continent. But there is a memory held in the silt of the seabed, a secret kept by the crushing weight of the tides. Beneath those hundreds of feet of brine lies a drowned world, a vast, silent landscape of rolling hills, winding river valleys, and deep, ancient forests that haven't seen the light of the sun for over 8 millennia. This is Doggerland. It was once the true heart of Europe, a sprawling continent larger than many modern nations, where the Thames and the Rhine were not separate rivers flowing into a sea, but mere tributaries that joined together in a great fertile plain before wandering toward the Atlantic. It was a place of immense abundance, where the mammoth and the red deer roamed through meadows of tall grass, and where our ancestors built their lives in a world that felt as permanent as the earth beneath your feet feels tonight. As you settle into your blankets and let the weight of the day begin to drift away, it is worth reflecting on the nature of deep time, the way the earth breathes in and out over tens of thousands of years. We often think of the map of the world as something fixed, something carved in stone, but the history of the North Sea tells us a different story. It tells us of a time when you could have walked from the site of modern-day London all the way to Copenhagen without ever wetting your toes, crossing over a land that was rich, vibrant, and teeming with life. Before we travel further back into these forgotten marshes and plains, I want to take a moment to acknowledge you as you settle in for your rest. If you are finding comfort in these echoes of the past, you are in the right place. Here at the Slumber Archives, we bring you new history narrations every single day, crafted to guide you into a deep and peaceful sleep. If you find these journeys helpful, please consider subscribing so that we can meet here again tomorrow night, and perhaps leave a like to help other weary travellers find their way to us. For now, let us return to the silence of the deep and the world that was lost beneath the waves. To understand how a continent disappears, we must look back to the last glacial maximum, a period roughly 20,000 years ago, when the world was gripped by a profound and biting cold. During this time, so much of the Earth's water was locked away in massive ice sheets, miles thick, that the global sea level was nearly 400 feet lower than it is today. The North Sea, as we know it, simply did not exist. Instead, there was a vast bridge of land, a tundra that stretched out from the edge of the ice, connecting what is now England to the Netherlands, Germany, and Denmark. The climate then was harsh, a world of permafrost and biting winds, but as the great gears of the planet began to shift, the ice started its long, slow retreat. This transition marked the beginning of the Holocene, our current geological epoch. As the glaciers melted, they did not just disappear, they transformed the landscape, carving out great furrows and depositing rich soils. For thousands of years, Doggerland was a paradise for the hunter-gatherers of the Mesolithic, the Middle Stone Age. These people did not see themselves as living on a bridge or a temporary landmass. To them, this was the center of the world. Archaeologists use the term stratigraphy to describe the layers of time built up in the earth, each one a page in a book that has been buried by the next. In Doggerland, that book is written in the mud. For over a century, fishermen trawling the shallow waters of the Dogger Bank have pulled up more than just fish. Their nets have snagged the bones of woolly mammoths, the skulls of lions, and the delicate, worked flint tools of the people who once hunted there. These artifacts are whispers from the deep, preserved in the anaerobic, or oxygen-free, environment of the seabed, which prevents decay and keeps the past strangely fresh. There is a certain mystery in the way we discover these things. We cannot simply walk out and excavate a site. Instead, we must rely on seismic surveys and radiocarbon dating, a process that measures the decay of carbon atoms to tell us exactly when a piece of wood or bone was last part of a living thing. Through these methods, we have begun to map a world we can never visit. We see the outlines of the Outer Dowsing Channel, a massive river system that once drained the meltwater of a continent. We see the Silver Pit, a deep depression that may have been a vast lake, surrounded by reeds and the calls of migratory birds. As the years passed and the climate continued to warm, the change was likely imperceptible to a single human life. A hunter might notice that the marshes stayed wet a little longer into the summer, or that a certain coastal path was now underwater during the highest spring tides. This was the era of the Younger Dryas, a brief, final snap of cold that momentarily halted the melting before the heat returned with a vengeance. When the ice finally gave way for good, the rise in sea levels became an inevitable, creeping tide. Imagine the stillness of a summer evening 10,000 years ago in the heart of Doggerland. The air would be thick with the hum of insects and the earthy scent of damp moss and peat. The forests of birch and pine would be spreading northward, reclaiming the land from the retreating tundra. It was a world of immense silence, broken only by the splashing of a beaver in a creek, or the distant low rumble of a collapsing ice shelf hundreds of miles to the north. The people living here were masters of their environment. They understood the migration patterns of the eels and the best time to gather hazelnuts. They were not primitive. They were perfectly adapted to a world that was slowly, quietly, beginning to vanish around them. The tragedy of Doggerland is not that it disappeared suddenly in a single day, though some theories suggest a final, catastrophic event. Rather, the mystery lies in the long, slow drowning, the way a home becomes an island, and an island becomes a sandbank, and a sandbank finally slips beneath the grey waves to become a memory. We are left to wonder about the stories told around the fires of those wandering bands. Did they have legends of the old lands to the east that were now beneath the salt? Did they watch the horizon with a sense of foreboding? Or did they simply move to higher ground, unaware that the very map of their world was being rewritten by the sun and the sea? As we drift further into the history of this submerged realm, the modern world feels very far away. The noise of traffic and the glow of screens fade, replaced by the vast, open sky of the Mesolithic. We are walking on soft earth now, through a valley that hasn't been dry for 8,000 years. The grass is tall, swaying in a breeze that carries the scent of the distant Atlantic, a sea that is coming inch by inch, century by century, to claim this place. For now the land is firm, the rivers are clear, and the deep time of the earth continues its slow, patient march, reminding us that everything we see is merely a moment in a much longer story. The water is cold, and the depths are dark, but in our minds the sun is still shining on the golden plains of Doggerland. We can almost hear the wind through the birch leaves, a soft hushing sound that invites us to let go of the present and sink into the long, quiet sleep of history. Imagine for a moment the sound of a world under pressure, not the sharp crack of breaking wood, but a slow tectonic groan that vibrates through the very soles of your feet. This is the sound of the earth yielding to a weight it was never meant to carry. Long before the first maps were drawn, the northern hemisphere lay beneath a shroud of ice so vast that it defies our modern sense of scale. This was the Weichselian glaciation, the final great cold of the Pleistocene epoch. It was a time when the atmosphere held its breath, and the very cycle of the seasons seemed to freeze in place. Across Scandinavia, through the Baltic, and down into the heart of northern Europe, the ice did not merely sit upon the land, it became the land. In some places, these sheets were 3 kilometers thick, a vertical wall of frozen blue and white that reached higher than many mountain peaks. If you were to stand at the base of such a wall, the top would be lost in the clouds, a jagged horizon of crystalline light that stretched on for thousands of miles. The sheer physical presence of this ice was enough to alter the shape of the planet itself. The Earth's crust, which we think of as solid and unyielding, is actually more like a slow-moving fluid when viewed through the lens of deep time. Under the crushing weight of billions of tons of ice, the ground beneath northern Europe began to sink, depressed into the mantle by the sheer gravity of the frozen mass. It is a strange thought to consider, that the very continent was being pushed down, bowing under the burden of the winter that would not end. And yet, as the land sank in the north, it tilted elsewhere, creating a complex geography of rising and falling shores that we are only now beginning to map with our modern instruments. As the ice grew, it acted like a giant, silent thief, stealing the water from the world's oceans. Every snowflake that fell upon the glacier was a drop of water that did not return to the sea. It was locked away, stored in a frozen vault for tens of thousands of years. As the centuries turned into millennia, the global sea levels began to drop, falling 30, 60, and eventually over 100 meters below where they sit today. The English Channel, the North Sea, the Irish Sea, all of these vanished. Where today the great tankers and fishing boats drift over deep currents, there was once only dry land. The seabed was exposed to the open air for the first time in an eternity, revealing a vast, low-lying plain that connected the British Isles to the rest of Europe. This was the birth of the Great Plain, the territory we now call Doggerland. It was a world born of the cold, a landscape carved by the slow, grinding movement of the ice sheets. As the glaciers advanced, they acted like massive bulldozers, scouring the earth, grinding rocks into fine silt and pushing huge mounds of debris, what geologists call moraines, ahead of them. This process created a rich, fertile foundation for the life that would eventually follow. But for a long time, there was only the silence of the frost. The air was dry and brittle, and the wind whipped across the tundra, carrying the scent of dust and ancient snow. It is difficult for us to imagine the scale of this isolation, a world where the horizon was dominated by a wall of ice that seemed as permanent as the stars. The weight of this ice did more than just depress the crust. It created a sort of geological memory that persists even today. When the ice finally began to melt, thousands of years later, the land began to slowly bounce back, a process known as isostatic rebound. Even now, northern Scandinavia is rising by several millimeters every year, still recovering from the pressure of the Weichselian sheets. But in those deep, frozen years, the land was held in a firm, cold grip. The water was trapped, the ground was compressed, and the geography of Europe was unrecognizable. London and Copenhagen were not separated by a sea, but by a vast expanse of rolling hills, winding rivers, and deep glacial lakes. The atmosphere during this period was a study in stillness. Because so much of the world's water was locked in the ice, there was less moisture in the air, leading to a climate that was not only cold, but incredibly dry. Great dust storms would occasionally sweep across the plains, depositing layers of fine, yellowish soil known as loess. This soil would one day become the bedrock of European agriculture, but during the height of the glaciation, it was simply part of a harsh, minimalist landscape. Yet even in this severity, there was a profound beauty, the way the low sun would catch the edges of the ice cliffs, turning them into pillars of fire, or the way the aurora borealis would dance over a world that knew no artificial light. We often think of the Ice Age as a static event, a single block of time where everything was frozen. But it was a living, breathing era of constant change. The ice sheets were not stationary. They flowed like incredibly slow rivers, carving into the distant sea and retreating or advancing based on the subtle wobbles of the Earth's orbit. These shifts, known as Milankovitch cycles, are the heartbeat of our planet's climate. Long, slow pulses that dictate the coming and going of the great frost. During the peaks of these cycles, the ice would reach its maximum extent, and the world would feel as though it might never thaw. Underneath the ice, the pressure was so great that it could melt the very bottom layer of the glacier, creating a thin film of water that allowed the massive sheet to slide across the bedrock. This subglacial plumbing system carved deep channels into the earth, some of which are still visible today as tunnel valleys buried beneath the North Sea. These are the hidden scars of the ice, the evidence of a power so great that it could reshape the very foundations of the continent. When we look at the bathymetry, the underwater topography of the North Sea today, we see the ghosts of these features. We see the outlines of ancient river valleys and the ridges of long-vanished hills, all of them moulded by the weight and movement of the Weichselian sheets. As the years stretched into the tens of thousands, the plants and animals of the south began to adapt to the fringes of this frozen world. The mammoth, the woolly rhinoceros, and the reindeer moved across the edges of the ice, finding sustenance in the hardy grasses that managed to take root in the loose soil. And somewhere, perhaps following the migrations of these great beasts, the first humans began to look toward the north. They saw a land that was harsh, yes, but also filled with opportunity. The receding sea had gifted them a new world, a vast open bridge between territories. To them, the ice was not a barrier, but a landmark, a constant, shimmering presence on the northern horizon. They would have walked across what is now the bottom of the sea, their footsteps muffled by the thick moss and the dry earth. They would have seen the great rivers, the Rhine, the Thames, the Seine, all flowing together into a single massive drainage system that emptied into the Atlantic far to the north. This was the landscape of the Great Plain, a place of endless possibility that existed only because the water was held captive by the frost. It is a haunting thought, to realize that the very existence of Doggerland was a temporary gift from the ice. It was a world built on a foundation of frozen water, a kingdom that would last only as long as the cold remained. As we settle into the stillness of this thought, we can almost feel the chill of that ancient wind. We can imagine the silence of the tundra, broken only by the distant crack of a glacier settling or the low call of a wandering herd. The ice sheets were the architects of this world, the silent giants that held the sea at bay and pressed the earth into new shapes. They were the guardians of the land that time forgot, a world where the horizon was a wall of white, and the future was written in the slow, patient movement of the frost. And as the planet began its long, slow tilt back toward the sun, the story of Doggerland was only just beginning to unfold. A story of life, of migration, and eventually of a slow and inevitable drowning beneath the rising tides. But for now, the ice remains, heavy, silent, and vast, holding the world in a cold, peaceful embrace. The weight of that ice was not merely a physical burden upon the earth, it was a thief of the world's oceans, locking the water away in crystalline towers that reached toward the stars. As the great glaciers of the last glacial maximum grew to their terrifying height, the seas themselves began to retreat, pulling back from the shorelines of the world like a long, slow inhalation. The water levels did not merely dip, they plummeted, falling by more than 120 meters. Imagine the English Channel, the North Sea, and the Irish Sea as they are today, grey, churning expanses of salt water, and then imagine that water simply vanishing. Where there were once waves, there was now only the damp, dark silt of the seabed, exposed to the air for the first time in an eternity. As the centuries turned into millennia, this newly revealed land did not remain a barren waste. It breathed, it settled, it transformed into a vast, rolling expanse of territory that effectively erased the borders of northern Europe. Britain was no longer an island, but a high, rocky peninsula of the European continent, tethered to the mainland by an area of land larger than many modern nations. Today, we call this Lost World Doggerland, named for the Dogger Bank, that shallow, sandy plateau in the North Sea that once stood as its highest hills. But in those days, it was simply the world, a sprawling, low-lying plain that stretched from the chalk cliffs of Kent to the fjords of Norway, and from the marshes of the Netherlands to the rugged coast of Scotland. Walking from the site of modern-day London to the future grounds of Copenhagen would not have required a boat or a bridge, but merely a long, steady journey across a landscape of incredible, quiet beauty. It was a world of immense open horizons, a place where the sky felt larger than the earth beneath it. In the beginning, this land bridge was a harsh and skeletal place, a tundra-like wilderness where the wind howled across plains of gravel and permafrost. The ground was hard, frozen deep into the stratigraphy, that layering of earth that geologists use to read the history of the world like a book. As the climate began to flicker with the first hints of warmth, the permafrost started to soften. The vast, flat plains of Doggerland became a mosaic of braided rivers, shallow lakes, and shimmering lagoons. It was a geography defined by the absence of heights. There were no mountains here, only the gentle rise and fall of ancient moraines, the heaps of debris left behind by retreating ice, and the winding paths of rivers like the Rhine, the Thames, and the Elbe, which all flowed together into a single, massive river system that carved its way through the heart of this hidden country. One can almost hear the sound of that world, not the roar of the ocean, but the constant, rhythmic trickle of melting ice and the sighing of the wind through short, hardy grasses. It was a land of silver and grey, of mosses and lichens that clung to the damp earth, creating a carpet of soft greens and browns that stretched as far as the eye could see. To look out across Doggerland in those early days was to look upon a frontier that felt eternal, a bridge of solid earth that seemed as permanent as the mountains themselves. The sheer scale of this land is difficult for the modern mind to grasp. We are so accustomed to the broken, jagged outlines of our maps, where the sea defines the limits of our reach. But in the deep time of the early Holocene, the map was whole. There was no North Sea. There was only the Great Plain, a silent, verdant expanse that invited the brave and the hungry to move northward. As the ice continued its slow, grudging retreat, the land bridge became a corridor for life. First came the hardy plants, then the great herds of reindeer and mammoth, and finally, following the tracks in the mud, came the humans. These early wanderers would have looked out over the marshes and seen a land of plenty, unaware that the very ground they walked upon was a temporary gift from the cold. They saw the vastness of the plains as a promise, a new beginning after the long, dark winter of the Ice Age. They moved across the river valleys, setting up camps where the fresh water met the brackish pools, living in a world where the horizon was never broken by the mast of a ship or the glint of the sea. But the mystery of Doggerland lies in its stillness, in the way it existed for thousands of years as a bustling, vibrant heart of the continent, only to vanish so completely that for centuries we forgot it had ever been there. We are left to wonder about the geography of those lost miles. Were there forests of stunted birch that shivered in the northern gales? Were there vast wetlands where the calls of migratory birds echoed off the surface of silent lakes? The evidence is there, hidden beneath the waves, buried in the peat and the sand of the sea floor, waiting for us to piece together the map of a world that was once our home. As the years passed, the landscape of the land bridge began to mature. The harsh, rocky tundra gave way to more complex ecosystems. The rivers grew wider and slower, depositing rich silts that turned the plains into a fertile paradise. It was a delicate balance, a moment in the history of the earth where the sea level was low enough to provide a home, but the climate was warm enough to sustain life. It was a golden age of geography, a time when the world felt connected, and the path forward was always just over the next low ridge. And yet, even in this time of emergence, the seeds of the end were already sown. Every inch of land that was revealed was a result of the ice's grip on the water. As that grip loosened, as the glaciers began to weep and the great meltwater lakes formed in the heart of the continents, the balance began to shift. The very warmth that made Doggerland habitable was also the force that would eventually reclaim it. But for a long, peaceful stretch of deep time, the bridge held firm. It was a world of vast distances and quiet wonders, a place where a traveller could start in the forests of Central Europe and walk day after day through a shifting landscape of meadows and marshes until they reached the high, white cliffs that looked out over the Atlantic. It was a land of continuity, a place where the boundaries of the world were not set by the tide, but by the strength of one's stride and the limits of the daylight. We often think of the past as a series of fixed points, but the story of the land bridge reminds us that the earth is a fluid, changing thing. The maps we draw today are merely a snapshot of a single moment in a much longer, much more dramatic story. Doggerland was a reality for far longer than many of our modern empires have existed. It was a cradle of culture and a highway for the soul, a vast stage upon which the first acts of our post-glacial history were performed. And so, we look back through the fog of time and the depth of the water, trying to imagine the smell of the damp earth and the sound of the wind across the great plain. We see the outlines of a lost world emerging from the darkness, a reminder that the ground beneath our feet is not as solid as it seems, and that the sea is a patient collector of all things. The land bridge was a shimmering temporary miracle, a world that rose from the depths only to return to them, leaving behind nothing but the echoes of a journey that began when the ice first started to fail. To understand the true nature of this vanished bridge, one must first listen to the silence of the grass. Long before the first oak forests took root in the warming soils of Europe, the landscape of Doggerland was defined by the endless, rhythmic swaying of the Mammoth Steppe. This was not a wasteland of barren ice, but a vast golden ocean of hardy vegetation, a biome that stretched from the Atlantic coast of Ireland all the way across the roof of the world to the Pacific shores of Siberia. It was a kingdom of mosses, of low-lying sedges, and of the resilient Artemisia, a silver-leafed herb that filled the cold air with a sharp, medicinal fragrance. As the years passed, this steppe functioned as a colossal biological highway, a bridge not just of soil, but of life itself. The ground was firm and dry, kept stable by the deep permafrost that lurked just beneath the surface, locking the earth into a solid foundation that could support the weight of giants. Here, the flora had adapted to a world of extremes, where the summers were brief but intense with light, and the winters were long, dark, and scoured by winds that carried the fine, powdery dust of ground-up mountains. In this environment, trees were a rarity, stunted by the cold or huddled in the sheltered lee of river valleys, leaving the horizon wide, open, and inviting to those with the strength to wander. Through this immense treeless expanse the great migrations began. Imagine, if you can, the low, resonant thrum of thousands of heavy hooves vibrating through the permafrost. The woolly mammoth, the undisputed sovereign of this lost domain, moved across Doggerland in slow, deliberate processions. These were creatures built for the deep time of the ice, draped in thick, multi-layered coats of mahogany hair that swept the tops of the tall grasses. Their curved tusks, some reaching lengths of over 10 feet, acted like great snowplows, clearing the winter drifts to reach the dried, nutrient-rich grasses hidden beneath. They did not merely inhabit the steppe, they created it, their constant grazing and trampling preventing the encroachment of forests and maintaining the open vista that defined their world. Alongside the mammoths moved the woolly rhinoceros, a solitary and formidable figure silhouetted against the pale sky. With its 2 horns and its heavy, humped shoulders, it drifted through the mists of the Great Plain like a ghost from a prehistoric dream. These animals were joined by herds of reindeer and wild horses, their movements dictated by the shifting seasons and the subtle changes in the wind. To these creatures, the English Channel did not exist. The North Sea was a distant rumour of salt and tide. For them, the journey from what we now call the Netherlands to the hills of Norfolk was simply a continuation of the same endless meadow, a seamless transition through a world without borders. As the ice continued its slow, agonizing retreat, the Mammoth Steppe became a theatre of profound biological exchange. It was a corridor where species from the east met those from the west, blending their lineages in the shadow of the receding glaciers. This was the era of the megafauna, a time when the scale of life matched the scale of the landscape. Giant deer, known as the Irish elk, moved with surprising grace through the scrubland, their antlers spanning 12 feet from tip to tip, a heavy crown that seemed to challenge the very laws of gravity. We must wonder what it felt like to stand in the centre of that vastness, where the sky met the earth in a perfect, unbroken circle. The air would have been impossibly clear, free of the moisture and haze of the modern maritime climate. The sounds were those of the wild, the whistle of the wind through the dry stalks of grass, the distant cry of a hunting wolf, and the deep, guttural grumbles of the mammoth herds communicating across the miles. It was a world of profound clarity and terrifying scale, a place where time seemed to move at the pace of the slow-grinding glaciers to the north. The soil itself tells a story of incredible endurance. Beneath the modern waves of the North Sea, researchers have found traces of this ancient carpet of life. They find the pollen of cold-tolerant flowers and the remains of beetles that can only survive in the biting chill of the tundra. These tiny fragments of evidence are the keys to understanding a lost ecology, a system that was perfectly balanced for a world that no longer exists. The Mammoth Steppe was not merely a place. It was a moment in the Earth's history, when the climate, the land, and the great beasts were in a state of precarious, frozen harmony. Meanwhile, the predators followed the shadows of the herds. The cave lion and the spotted hyena prowled the fringes of the great migrations, their presence a constant reminder of the thin line between life and death on the open plain. These hunters were as much a part of the steppe as the grass itself, thinning the weak and ensuring the vitality of the herds. In the silence of the Doggerland nights, under a canopy of stars undimmed by the fires of civilization, the calls of these predators would have echoed for leagues, a haunting soundtrack to a world that was vibrant, brutal, and utterly indifferent to the passage of centuries. The role of Doggerland as a biological highway cannot be overstated. It was the vital link that allowed the heartbeat of the continent to pulse into the British Isles. Without this connection, the history of life in this corner of the world would have been vastly different, a fragmented story of isolation rather than one of grand, sweeping movement. The steppe provided the fuel for the journey, the grass that fed the mammoths, who in turn shaped the land for the smaller creatures that followed in their wake. It was a complex web of dependency woven across thousands of square miles of fertile, frozen earth. As we contemplate this drowned landscape, we are forced to confront the limits of our own memory. The Mammoth Steppe flourished for tens of thousands of years, a duration that dwarfs the entirety of recorded human history. For the vast majority of its existence, Doggerland was not a sea, but a thriving, breathing ecosystem, a place of immense productivity and life. The fact that it is now hidden beneath 60 feet of cold green water feels like a trick of the light, a sudden disappearance that defies our sense of permanence. The transition from this cold, grassy paradise to the world we know today was not a single event, but a slow, rhythmic shifting of the gears of the planet. As the temperature began to rise ever so slightly, the permafrost began to soften. The ground, once as hard as stone, became boggy and treacherous in the summer months. The silver artemisia and the hardy grasses began to struggle as the air grew heavy with moisture. The first pioneers of a new era, the birches and the willows, began to appear in the sheltered valleys, their seeds carried on the warming breeze. The mammoths, sensing the change in the texture of the world, perhaps felt the first stirrings of unease. The open horizons were beginning to close in as the forests crept northward, fragmenting the vast pastures they required to survive. The biological highway was beginning to crumble, not from the bottom up, but from the edges inward as the rising sea nibbled at the low-lying coastlines and the changing climate altered the very chemistry of the soil. And so the era of the Great Steppe began to fade into the twilight of the Pleistocene. It remains a world of mystery, a chapter of our planet's biography that is written in the bones of giants and the microscopic grains of ancient pollen. We look out over the grey waters of the North Sea today and see only a void, but beneath those waves lies the ghost of a golden meadow, a place where the wind once sang through the grass and the mammoths walked with the heavy, rhythmic step of those who believe their world will last forever. The transition begins not with a sudden roar, but with a softening of the air, as the grip of the younger Dryas, that final bitter cold snap that lasted over 1,000 years, finally begins to loosen. The world takes a long, slow breath. The ice sheets, once miles thick and heavy enough to warp the very crust of the earth, start to weep. This meltwater does not merely disappear, it flows, carves and pools, transforming the stark, tundra-like plains of the ancient North Sea floor into something vibrant and new. The harsh, biting winds of the glacial age are replaced by a humid, gentle breeze that carries the scent of damp earth and awakening life. We find ourselves now in the Mesolithic, a Middle Stone Age where the landscape of Doggerland reaches its most fertile and magnificent peak. It is no longer a frozen bridge between continents, but a sprawling garden of water and wood. Imagine standing on a low ridge of chalk, looking out over a horizon that seems to shimmer with the silver reflection of 1,000 lakes. The great rivers that we know today as the Rhine, the Thames, and the Elbe do not flow into separate seas. Instead, they converge and meander across this vast lowland, their currents slowing as they find the flat, receptive heart of the basin. They weave together in a complex tapestry of deltas, creating a labyrinth of freshwater lagoons and winding channels that stretch further than the eye can see. The silence of the old ice is replaced by a symphony of liquid sounds. There is the constant, low-frequency gurgle of brooks pushing through silt, the rhythmic lap of water against reed beds, and the sudden, splashing leap of a pike in the shallows. This is a world defined by its edges, the places where the land meets the water and the water meets the sky. It is a transitional realm, a place of constant flux where the tides of the distant ocean begin to push tentatively into the river mouths, mixing salt with fresh and creating the richest ecosystems the planet has ever known. As the temperatures continue to climb, the vegetation responds with a slow-motion explosion of green. The hardy grasses and mosses of the tundra give way to sprawling marshes of reed and sedge. Along the riverbanks, the first pioneers of the forest appear. willows with their drooping, silvery leaves, and birches with bark as white as bone. As the centuries pass, the deeper soils support the arrival of the giants, oak, elm, and lime trees, their canopies knitting together to create a high, rustling roof over the damp earth. This is not the dark, impenetrable forest of fairy tales, but a sun-dappled woodland broken by wide, flowery glades and the shimmering expanse of the wetlands. The biodiversity of this Mesolithic paradise is staggering, a concentration of life that would make our modern wildernesses seem quiet and empty by comparison. In the thickets of the undergrowth, the wild boar roots through the leaf litter, its grunts echoing in the cool morning air. Red deer with antlers like branching trees move through the shadows with a ghostly silence, while the massive aurochs, the wild, formidable ancestors of modern cattle, graze in the lush meadows of the floodplains. To the hunter-gatherers who called this place home, it was a land of unimaginable plenty. Every season brought a new bounty, a predictable cycle of life that sustained generation after generation in a state of relative abundance. In the spring, the skies would darken with the arrival of millions of migratory birds. Swans, geese, and ducks descended upon the lagoons in such numbers that the sound of their wings was said to be like a rushing wind. They nested in the safety of the reeds, their eggs providing a concentrated source of protein for those who knew where to look. In the rivers, the water literally boiled with fish. Atlantic salmon and sea trout, driven by an ancient instinct, fought their way upstream in silver torrents, while the slow-moving sturgeon cruised the depths like prehistoric monsters. Eels, too, moved in their millions, a slippery, nutritious harvest that could be caught with simple traps woven from willow branches. The people of Doggerland did not merely survive here. They thrived. They were masters of the water, navigating the complex network of lagoons in dugout canoes carved from single, massive lime trees. For them, the water was not a barrier, but a highway, a means of moving through a landscape that was otherwise thick with growth. They built their camps on the high ground, the sandy ridges and hills that rose above the marshes like islands in a green sea. From these vantage points, they could watch the movement of the herds and the changing of the light across the water. Their lives were tuned to the subtle rhythms of the wetland, the rise and fall of the water levels, the blooming of the water lilies, and the ripening of hazelnuts in the autumn woods. Archaeology tells us of this prosperity through the humble remains left behind in the peat. We find harpoons carved with exquisite detail from deer antler, designed to spear the heavy fish of the deltas. We find the remains of hazelnut shells in vast quantities, suggesting communal gatherings where the forest's harvest was shared and processed. There is a sense of stability in these finds, a suggestion that for several thousand years this was perhaps the most densely populated and culturally vibrant part of Europe. It was a heartland, a central hub of innovation and connection that linked the tribes of the British Peninsula with those of the European mainland. Yet there is a haunting quality to this abundance when viewed through the lens of deep time. We know, as the Mesolithic people could not, that this paradise was built upon a foundation of shifting sand. The very warmth that brought the lush forests and the teeming lagoons was also the force that would eventually destroy them. Every degree of temperature that invited the oak and the elm also meant another inch of sea level rise. As the global ice continued to melt, the marshes were fertile because they were low, and because they were low, they were vulnerable. As the years passed, the character of the wetlands began to change. The salt began to creep further inland, turning freshwater lagoons into brackish marshes. The Great Plain, once a vast expanse of solid earth, was being slowly dissected by the rising tide. What was once a continuous forest was becoming an archipelago of islands, separated by widening channels of grey salt water. The people would have noticed the change in the trees first, the way the oaks near the coast began to wither and die as their roots drank in the salt, creating ghost forests of bleached standing timber that rattled in the wind. We often wonder how they interpreted these changes. Did they have stories of a time when the sea was a week's walk away, rather than a day's? Did the elders point out landmarks that were now submerged beneath the waves? In a world without writing, history is a fragile thing, carried in the breath of storytellers and the memory of the landscape itself. As the geography of their world shifted, so too must have their culture, their territories, and their understanding of the earth's permanence. They were a people of the edge, living in a masterpiece of nature that was being slowly reclaimed by the very elements that had created it. The Mesolithic Paradise of Doggerland remains one of the great what-ifs of human history. It was a world of incredible complexity and beauty, a place where the human spirit was forged in a landscape of water and light. It reminds us that our planet is never truly static, that the maps we draw today are merely snapshots of a single moment in a much longer, more fluid story. We look back at those lush wetlands, not with pity, but with a quiet awe for the richness of a lost world that once existed, where now only the cold currents of the North Sea flow. The bones of the aurochs and the flint tools of the hunters rest there still, cradled in the silt, waiting in the eternal twilight of the drowned plains. The sharp, rhythmic tapping of flint against stone echoes through the morning mist, a sound that has not been heard in these reaches for nearly 9,000 years. To understand who once walked these drowned plains, we must look to the traces they left behind in the mud, the delicate, bone-carved harpoons, and the microliths, those tiny, razor-sharp stone inserts that once tipped the spears of a people we now call the Maglemosian culture. The name itself comes from the Danish word for big bog, a fitting tribute to the landscape they mastered. These were not mere wanderers lost in a wilderness, but a sophisticated, deeply rhythmic society that moved in perfect harmony with the pulse of the changing seasons. As the winter ice retreated farther north, these nomadic tribes followed the ancient pathways carved by the deer and the elk. Their world was one of constant, gentle motion. In the high heat of summer, they might congregate along the sandy ridges of what is now the Dogger Bank, where the air was thick with the scent of salt spray and ripening berries. When the first frosts touched the grass, they would retreat into the sheltered river valleys, their skin-covered dwellings nestled among the reeds. To the Maglemosians, the land was not a static map, but a living, breathing entity that provided everything in its own time. They understood the language of the birds, the migration patterns of the eels, and the exact moment when the hazelnuts were ready for harvest. Their daily lives were defined by a quiet, industrious focus. Imagine a group of hunters crouched by a slow-moving stream, their hands moving with practiced grace as they weave traps from willow branches. They are patient, waiting for the silver flash of a pike in the shallows. Nearby, women and children gather the starchy roots of water lilies, their feet sinking into the cool, dark peat. There is no sense of urgency here, only the steady, methodical work of survival. They used the resin of birch trees as a primitive glue, heated over small fires to set their stone blades into wooden handles. Every tool was a testament to their ingenuity, a bridge between the raw materials of the earth and the needs of the tribe. Archaeology often speaks of these people through the lens of stratigraphy, the study of rock and soil layers that allows us to read time like the pages of a book. In the deep silts of the North Sea, the Maglemosian layer sits as a thin, dark band of organic history, preserved by the lack of oxygen in the underwater environment. Through radiocarbon dating, a process that measures the decay of carbon atoms to tell us exactly how many thousands of years have passed, we can pin these lives to a specific window of time following the Younger Dryas. This was a brief, final cold snap that gripped the world before the climate truly began to warm. And it was in this warming world that the Maglemosian culture flourished, turning the vast wetlands of Doggerland into a garden of plenty. But beyond the flint and the bone, there was a deeper, more ethereal layer to their existence. The Maglemosians possessed a profound spiritual connection to the waterways that defined their horizon. To them, the rivers were not just sources of food or routes for travel, but veins of the earth, carrying the spirits of the ancestors and the essence of the wild. We find evidence of this in the strange and beautiful artifacts recovered from the seabed, amber pendants carved into the shapes of animals, and red deer frontlets that were worn as headdresses, perhaps during sacred dances that mimicked the movements of the herd. As the years passed, this connection to the land likely took on a bittersweet quality. They would have noticed the subtle changes, the way the high tide reached a little further up the bank each season, or how a favourite hunting ground slowly transformed into a salt marsh, and then, eventually, vanished beneath the waves. They did not have the words for global sea level rise, but they possessed a keen, observational wisdom. They lived in a world that was literally melting away beneath their feet, yet they did not panic. They simply moved, shifting their hearths and their homes a few yards inland every generation, maintaining their dialogue with a landscape that was increasingly defined by water. The Maglemosian culture represents a moment of perfect equilibrium, a time when humanity was small enough to fit within the gaps of the natural world without tearing its fabric. They left no monuments of stone, no towering ruins to mark their passing. Instead, they left the quiet debris of a life well lived, a discarded fishing net, a broken paddle, a collection of charred hazelnut shells. These fragments, pulled up by modern trawlers or discovered by divers in the dim light of the seabed, are the only voices remaining from a civilization that once spanned the heart of Europe. We might wonder what they thought about as they sat by their fires at night, looking out over the moonlit marshes. Did they tell stories of a time when the sea was even further away? Did they sense that the great plains they called home were destined to become a memory? In the silence of the deep time that separates us, we can almost hear the soft lapping of the water against their canoes, a constant reminder of the fluid boundary between the world of the living and the world that was slowly being reclaimed by the tide. Their spiritual life was likely as vast and interconnected as the wetlands themselves. In the animistic traditions that often characterize such cultures, every tree, every stone, and every bend in the river had a name and a story. The great aurochs, with their massive horns and thunderous gait, were surely seen as more than just meat. They were the embodiments of strength and the wild spirit of the plains. To hunt such a creature was a sacred act, a heavy responsibility that required rituals of respect and gratitude. When we find the bones of these animals today, scarred by the marks of flint tools, we are looking at the remnants of a communion between the hunter and the hunted that modern minds can scarcely imagine. The Maglemosians were masters of the edge, the place where the forest meets the marsh, where the fresh water meets the brine. This liminal space was where life was most abundant and where the veil between the physical and the spiritual was thinnest. As they moved through the tall reeds in their dugout canoes, carved from a single massive trunk of lime or oak, they were navigating a world of shadows and reflections. The water was a mirror, reflecting a sky that seemed to stretch on forever, unbroken by the silhouettes of the cities that would one day rise from the mud. As the climate continued to shift, the very geography of their spirituality must have evolved. The rising waters were not merely a physical challenge, but perhaps a divine one, a slow, relentless reclaiming of the earth by the powers of the deep. Yet, there is a sense of peace in the archaeological record, a lack of evidence for the kind of violent conflict that often marks the end of later civilizations. The Maglemosians were a people of the flow, as adaptable as the rivers they followed. They remind us that to inhabit a place is to enter into a contract with it, to accept its gifts and its changes with equal grace. In the long, slow twilight of Doggerland, these first inhabitants lived out their days with a quiet dignity, their footfalls leaving impressions in the soft earth that would soon be sealed away by the rising North Sea. They were the guardians of a world that no longer exists, a world of endless green and shimmering blue, where the horizon was a promise rather than a boundary. As we drift further into the history of this drowned realm, we carry their memory with us, the memory of a time when the heart of Europe was a wetland paradise, and when the simple act of walking from one end of the continent to the other was a journey through a living, breathing map of wonders. The artifacts they left behind, the amber, the bone, the flint, are like messages in bottles tossed into the currents of time and washed up on the shores of our modern consciousness. They ask us to remember that we too are part of a changing world, and that the ground beneath our feet is only as permanent as the sea allows it to be. The Maglemosians knew this truth intimately, and in the silence of their submerged campsites, that truth remains, cradled by the tides, waiting for us to listen. Imagine a world defined not by the solid boundaries of a map, but by the constant rhythmic pulse of moving water. Long before the North Sea claimed its current dominion, the heart of this lost continent was dictated by a vascular system of rivers so vast they defy our modern understanding of European geography. To stand in the centre of Doggerland 9,000 years ago was to stand at the crossroads of a watery empire, where the great arteries of the continent converged into a single, shimmering delta. In this era, the rivers we know today as separate entities, the Rhine, the Meuse and the Thames, were not strangers divided by a saltwater channel. Instead, they were branches of the same tree, flowing toward one another through a low-lying plain of reeds and willow to form a monumental confluence that served as the lifeblood of the interior. The Rhine, carrying the cold meltwaters from the distant Alps, travelled north alongside the Meuse, their currents braiding together across a landscape that was almost perfectly flat. As they moved through what is now the southern reaches of the North Sea, they were joined by the Thames, which flowed eastward from the hills of Britain. This was not the narrow, embanked river that winds through London today, but a wild, sprawling giant, unburdened by stone walls or bridges. Where these titans met, they created a delta of such complexity and richness that it likely rivaled the modern-day Mississippi or the Amazon in its biological intensity. It was a labyrinth of silt islands, shifting sandbars, and deep, slow-moving lagoons where the fresh water of the continent gathered its strength before making its final journey toward the edge of the world. As the years passed, this massive volume of water carved a path that geologists call the Channel River, or the Fleuve Manche. This was a waterway of staggering proportions, a river that flowed through the dry valley of the English Channel toward the Atlantic Ocean. To the people living along its banks, this river was everything. It was a highway for travel, a source of endless food, and a sacred boundary between the known and the unknown. The sound of its flowing was the constant background music to their lives, a deep, low-toned murmur that echoed through the misty mornings and the long, quiet dusks of the Mesolithic. The sheer scale of this drainage system meant that the interior of Doggerland was never truly dry, but rather a world in a state of perpetual dampness and fertility. The river systems acted as a giant pump, bringing nutrients from the heart of Europe into the great North Plain. This created a paradise for the creatures of the marsh. In the soft mud of the riverbanks, one might find the massive footprints of the aurochs, those ancient, formidable wild cattle, alongside the delicate tracks of the roe deer. The rivers were thick with salmon and sturgeon, silver flashes beneath the surface of the tea-coloured water, migrating in numbers that we can scarcely imagine today. For the human inhabitants, the confluence was the centre of the universe. It provided a level of stability in a world that was otherwise defined by change, while the glaciers, far to the north, were beginning their slow, agonizing retreat. And the sea levels were rising by millimeters each year. The great rivers remained a constant. They were a guide. If a hunting party followed the Thames westward, they knew they would eventually reach the high chalk ridges of Britain. If they followed the Rhine southward, they would find themselves moving toward the dense forests of the European mainland. The rivers were the threads that held the fabric of Doggerland together, connecting distant families and disparate cultures through a shared reliance on the flow of the water. We must try to visualize the sensory experience of this vanished delta. The air would have been heavy with the scent of damp earth, decaying vegetation, and the sweet, sharp smell of blooming meadowsweet. In the spring, the sound of the rivers would swell as the winter snows melted, the water turning a muddy brown and carrying the trunks of fallen oaks toward the sea. In the heat of midsummer, the flow would slow to a lazy crawl, the surface of the lagoons covered in white water lilies, while the hum of dragonflies filled the air. It was a landscape of immense horizontal beauty, where the sky met the water in a blur of grey and blue, and the horizon seemed to stretch on forever. Archaeologists today use sophisticated sonar and seismic profiling to peer beneath the seabed, mapping the ancient channels that have been filled with silt for millennia. These paleochannels are like the ghost limbs of the continent. When we look at these maps, we see the intricate, winding patterns of the old riverbeds, preserved like veins in marble. They reveal a level of topographical complexity that was hidden for centuries beneath the waves. We see where the rivers meandered, where they flooded, and where they formed deep pools that would have been ideal spots for fishing camps. There is a certain quiet melancholy in the realization that these great rivers, which once defined the lives of thousands of people, now flow into a vacuum. The Thames still flows, and the Rhine still carries its heavy burden to the sea, but their meeting point is gone. The great confluence, the heart of the Doggerland interior, is now buried under meters of salt water and sand. The Channel River, once the largest waterway in Europe, has been replaced by the tides of the English Channel. As we contemplate this drowned geography, we are forced to reckon with the concept of deep time, the idea that the Earth is a restless, shifting entity, and that our current maps are merely a single frame in a very long movie. The people of Doggerland did not see their world as disappearing. To them, the rivers were eternal. They built their lives around the seasonal rhythms of the water, trusting in the permanence of the banks and the reliability of the currents. They could not have known that the very water that sustained them would eventually become the force that erased their homeland. Meanwhile, the sediment at the bottom of the North Sea continues to hold the secrets of this era. Within the layers of the old riverbeds, there are preserved seeds, pollen grains, and even the delicate wings of insects that lived thousands of years ago. These tiny fragments of life allow us to reconstruct the environment of the great river systems with surprising detail. We know that the banks were lined with alder and birch trees, and that the marshes were home to vast colonies of waterfowl. It was a world of abundance, driven by the ceaseless movement of the water. The rivers were also messengers of change. As the climate warmed during the period known as the Holocene, the rivers became more prone to flooding and the marshes began to expand. The ground became softer, the paths more difficult to navigate. The people would have noticed the subtle shifts, the way the spring floods stayed a little longer each year, or the way the salt water tides began to push further upstream into the freshwater deltas. The rivers, once the providers of life, were beginning to carry the first warnings of the coming inundation. What must it have been like to witness the slow transformation of a river into an estuary, to see the familiar reeds die back as the salt water poisoned their roots, replaced by the hardy plants of the salt marsh? This was not a sudden catastrophe, but a gradual, creeping reality. The great confluence, once the vibrant heart of a continent, was slowly being reclaimed by the sea, one tide at a time. The rivers that had once connected London to Copenhagen were being severed, their waters forced back into the land as the ocean rose to meet them. In the silence of the modern North Sea, those ancient currents still seem to whisper. The water above the Dogger Bank is restless, churned by the winds and the tides, but deep below, the silhouettes of the old rivers remain etched into the earth. They are a reminder of a time when Europe was whole, when the Rhine and the Thames shared the same valley, and when a traveller could walk for weeks through a landscape of endless water and sky, guided only by the flow of the great river systems toward the setting sun. For centuries, the North Sea was known to sailors not as a graveyard of a lost world, but as a treacherous, shallow obstacle. To the fishermen of the 19th century, the Dogger Bank was a place of bounty and frustration in equal measure. They knew it as a vast, submerged plateau where the water thinned, sometimes to a depth of only 50 feet, causing the waves to chop and churn with a particular, restless violence. Their heavy nets, dragged along the seabed in search of cod and herring, would often snag on something stubborn and unseen. They called these obstructions rough ground, and they cursed the debris that tore their hempen mesh and stalled their progress. But when they hauled those nets back to the surface, the refuse they pulled from the dark water began to tell a story that defied the maps of the modern world. Instead of rocks or modern wreckage, the trawlers were bringing up massive blackened bones. Enormous teeth, some the size of a man's head, would tumble onto the slick wooden decks, slick with silt and smelling of the deep earth. These were the molars of mammoths, preserved in the cold anaerobic mud for thousands of years. Alongside them came the heavy antlers of giant elk and the sturdy limbs of woolly rhinoceros. To the fishermen, these were mere curiosities, mermaids' purses or giants' bones to be kept as trinkets or sold to collectors in the ports of Yarmouth and Grimsby. They did not yet realize that their nets were reaching back through the veil of time, dragging the skeletal remains of a vanished tundra into the light of the industrial age. The seafloor was giving up more than just bone. Mixed in with the catch were strange, heavy clumps of what the sailors called moorlog. This was a dense, dark peat, so compressed and ancient that it felt almost like coal. When it was dried and broken open, it revealed the perfectly preserved remains of birch leaves, hazelnut shells, and the wings of beetles that had sparkled in the sun 10,000 years ago. This moorlog was the very soil of Doggerland, a compressed memory of forests and marshes that had once breathed under an open sky. It was a strange sensation for those Victorian mariners to stand miles from any shore and hold in their hands the muddy evidence of a forest floor. They were fishing over a drowned garden, a landscape that had been silenced by the rising tides of the Holocene, the current geological epoch that began as the great ice sheets retreated. As the years passed, the scale of these finds grew, yet they remained fragmented, like pieces of a puzzle scattered across a dark room. Science was beginning to understand the concept of deep time, the idea that the Earth's history stretched back far beyond human record, but the notion of a vast inhabited plain between England and Denmark still felt like a ghost story. Then, in the year 1932, a small commercial trawler named the Colinda was working the waters near the Leman and Ower banks, about 25 miles off the coast of Norfolk. The skipper, a man named Pilgrim Lockwood, was used to the usual debris of the deep. But on this particular night, the net brought up a large block of moorlog that contained something different, something that had been shaped by a human hand. Tangled within the ancient peat was a slender, elegant object made of bone. It was a harpoon point, nearly 9 inches long, with a row of sharp, delicate barbs carved along one side. It was not a fossil, nor was it a natural formation. It was a tool. It was a weapon designed for the hunt, crafted with precision and intent by someone who had lived and breathed in a world that now lay under 80 feet of salt water. The Colinda harpoon, as it came to be known, was a revelation. It provided the first undeniable proof that the drowned world was not just a wilderness of animals, but a home for humanity. This was a sophisticated piece of technology from the Maglemosian culture, a group of hunter-gatherers who thrived in the forest wetlands of northern Europe at the end of the last ice age. The discovery sent ripples through the halls of archaeology. It forced a realization that the history of Europe was incomplete, that the most fertile and perhaps most populated regions of the continent were now inaccessible, hidden beneath the waves. The harpoon was dated to roughly 9,000 years ago, a period known as the Mesolithic, or the Middle Stone Age. This was a time when the climate was warming, the ice was melting, and the people of Doggerland were living in a paradise of biodiversity. They were not primitive drifters, but skilled navigators of a complex environment, moving with the seasons through a world of lagoons, reed beds, and high ridges. The harpoon point spoke of a specific moment in time, a hunter standing perhaps at the edge of a slow-moving creek, the morning mist clinging to the water, waiting for the silver flash of a large pike or the dark shape of an otter. When that hunter lost their weapon, or perhaps discarded it in a moment of ritual, they could never have imagined that it would rest in the silt for 9 millennia, only to be dragged into the air by a steam-powered boat in a world of iron and coal. It was a bridge across the abyss of time, a physical link to a person whose language, songs, and gods are entirely lost to us. But how do we piece together a world we cannot see? Archaeology usually relies on stratigraphy, the study of the layers of the earth, where the deeper one digs, the further back in time one travels. But in the North Sea, the stratigraphy is chaotic, churned by centuries of currents and the heavy drag of fishing nets. The echoes from the deep are often out of context, stripped of the soil that once held them. Yet the sheer volume of material is staggering. Thousands of flint tools, barbed points, and even human remains have been recovered from the North Sea over the last century. Each find is a whisper from a ghost, a reminder that the map of the world is not a permanent thing, but a temporary arrangement of water and stone. We are left to wonder about the thousands of other objects that still lie down there, settled in the valleys of the submerged landscape. There may be entire campsites, the post holes of wooden huts, and the charred remains of ancient hearths, all preserved in the cold, oxygen-free environment of the seabed. These are the archives of a forgotten civilization, a library written in bone and peat. The Dogger Bank, once feared as a hazard to navigation, has become a sacred site of memory, a place where the boundaries between the land and the sea, and between the past and the present, blur into the grey-blue horizon. As the currents continue to shift the sands, they occasionally peel back the layers of the deep, offering us a fleeting glimpse of the world that was, before the great silence of the water took it all away. The sound of a retreating wave is rarely a sound of alarm. It is a rhythmic, predictable sigh that has defined the edges of our world for eons. But for the people of the Mesolithic, those wandering tribes of the Middle Stone Age who lived 10,000 years ago, the sea began to sing a different, more persistent song. It was a melody of slow, relentless encroachment. As the planet emerged from the grip of the last great ice age, a phenomenon known as thermal expansion began to take hold. A process where the warming of the atmosphere causes the very molecules of the ocean to expand, taking up more space and pushing the water higher and higher against the shore. To an individual hunter, the change might have been almost invisible. Perhaps a favorite campsite near a freshwater spring felt a little more damp in the spring than it had in the years of their youth. Perhaps a particular grove of hazel trees, once a day's walk from the salt spray, found its roots suddenly tasting of brine. But over the span of generations, these small, quiet shifts accumulated into a profound transformation of the landscape. This was not a sudden deluge, not a cinematic wall of water, but a slow, patient theft of the earth. The land was not being conquered so much as it was being dissolved, one tide at a time, as the warming world breathed out its icy breath and let the waters rise. Imagine a grandfather sitting by a fire, pointing out toward a shimmering expanse of mudflats and grey waves. He tells his grandchildren of a time when, as a boy, he could walk for 2 days in that direction without ever seeing the sea, how there were valleys filled with red deer and thickets where the wild boar hid in shadows that no longer exist. The children look out at the water, unable to truly fathom a world where the horizon was made of silver birch and rolling hills instead of the endless, undulating blue. This was the psychological weight of living in Doggerland during its final millennia. A slow ancestral mourning for a geography that was slipping through their fingers like wet sand. As the years passed, the tribes were forced into a perpetual state of retreat. This migration was not a frantic flight, but a measured, rhythmic movement inland. Yet for a culture so deeply tied to the specific spirits of the land, to the sacredness of certain ridges, the memory of specific hunting grounds, and the burial places of their kin, this loss was more than just a matter of survival. It was an erasure of their history. Each time the sea claimed a valley, it also claimed the stories tied to that valley. The landmarks that served as the mnemonic anchors for their oral traditions were being pulled beneath the waves, leaving the survivors to navigate a world that was becoming increasingly unfamiliar. The rich alluvial plains that once connected Britain to the continent were the heart of their world. These were the prime real estate of the Mesolithic, teeming with life from the massive aurochs, those ancient, formidable wild cattle, to the countless migratory birds that darkened the skies. As the water rose, these vast plains were fractured into smaller and smaller islands. The connectivity that had allowed for the easy exchange of flint, ideas, and marriage partners began to break down. The people found themselves clinging to the high ground, watching as the familiar paths between communities were severed by the widening channels of the North Sea. There is a particular kind of quiet that accompanies a rising tide in a forest. It is the sound of leaves rustling against water instead of earth, the sound of trees dying on their feet as the salt poisons their systems. These ghost forests would have been a common sight along the retreating coastline of Doggerland. Skeletons of oak and pine standing white and bleached in the marshes, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers over the encroaching waves. For the ancient inhabitants, these dying forests were a visual manifestation of the world's end, a slow-motion catastrophe that they could neither stop nor fully understand. They moved their hearths to higher ground, carrying their meagre possessions and their heavy memories, always looking back at the shimmering blue line that followed them with a terrifying, liquid patience. Archaeologists today use the term stratigraphy to describe the layers of time buried in the earth, where the deeper you dig, the further back you travel into the past. But in the drowned world of Doggerland, the stratigraphy is horizontal, spread out across the seabed in a vast, watery map. The rising tide didn't just cover the land, it preserved it in a tomb of silt and peat. Beneath the churning currents of the modern shipping lanes, there are still preserved footprints in the mud. Footprints of children and dogs, frozen in time at the very moment the water came to stay. These are the echoes of a people who lived in the shadow of a changing climate, witnessing the slow dissolution of their entire reality. As the thermal expansion continued, the very chemistry of the ocean changed, becoming warmer and less salty as the glacial meltwater poured in. This altered the migration patterns of the fish and the behavior of the seals, forcing the tribes to constantly reinvent their way of life. They became more maritime, more reliant on the very element that was destroying their homes. They carved dugout canoes from the trunks of the dying trees, venturing out into the new estuaries and lagoons that were forming where forests once stood. They were a people in transition, caught between a terrestrial past and an aquatic future, living on the thin, shifting edge of a world that was being rewritten by the sun and the sea. And so, the map of Europe began to take its modern shape, not through a single event, but through the relentless accumulation of small moments. A storm that pushed the high water mark an inch further inland. A winter where the ice didn't reach quite as far. A summer where the heat felt just a little more oppressive. To the people of Doggerland, these were not data points in a climate model, but the lived reality of a vanishing home. They watched the hills become islands, and the islands become shoals, until finally, the land they called their own existed only in the songs of the elders, whispered over fires on the new, higher shores of a smaller world. The psychological impact of this loss is something we can only imagine through the dim lens of deep time. How does a culture maintain its identity when its sacred geography is gone? When the places where your ancestors are buried are now 100 feet below the surface of a cold, grey sea? Perhaps they told stories of a great spirit who was thirsty, or of a world that was being washed clean for a new beginning. We see the evidence of their resilience in the flint tools found on the seabed, in the harpoons carved from antler that have been pulled up in fishing nets. They did not simply disappear. They adapted, they moved, and they carried the memory of the drowned land with them into the new territories of the West and the East. The rising tide was a teacher of a harsh and beautiful lesson, that the earth is not a static stage but a living, breathing entity that shifts and changes on a scale that dwarfs the human lifespan. As the waters rose, the people of Doggerland were forced to look toward the horizon and wonder what lay beyond the next ridge, the next island, the next sea. Their world was shrinking, yet in many ways their perspective was forced to expand. They were the first witnesses to the fragility of our coastal existence, the first to understand that the boundary between the land and the sea is nothing more than a temporary agreement, written in the shifting tides and the warming air of a planet in constant flux. In the silence of the deep, the drowned world remains. It is a world of shadows and silt, where the sunlight barely reaches the remains of the ancient valleys. But if you listen closely to the rhythm of the waves hitting the modern shores of Norfolk or Denmark, you can almost hear the echoes of those retreating footsteps. You can almost feel the weight of those forgotten ages, when the world was larger, and the sea was a distant rumour, and the land stretched out forever under a sky that was just beginning to warm. The tide continues to rise, and the story of Doggerland continues to be written, a long, slow poem of loss and endurance, drifting forever in the grey-blue memory of the deep. The silence of the rising water was not a sudden roar, but a persistent, rhythmic pulse, a slow infiltration of the lowlands that changed the very shape of the horizon. As the centuries drifted by, the vast, unbroken plains of Doggerland began to surrender to the North Sea, not in one great drowning, but through 1,000 small betrayals of the earth. The familiar paths that once led across salt marshes and through dense birch forests were slowly intercepted by the brine. What was once a continent, a solid bridge of flint and peat connecting the Thames to the Rhine, began to fray at the edges. The land was no longer a singular entity, but was becoming a mosaic, a scattering of high ground and ridges that resisted the encroaching blue. The geography of northern Europe was fracturing into an archipelago. Where hunters once tracked elk across endless grasslands, they now found themselves standing on the shores of shrinking islands, watching the valleys they once called home turn into shallow lagoons. This process of fragmentation created a world of isolated pockets, a series of emerald islands rising out of a deepening sea. The great northern plain was dissolving as the meltwater from the distant, retreating ice sheets continued its steady march into the basins. The higher ridges of Doggerland, places like the Dogger Bank itself, remained above the waves, becoming the last strongholds of a fading world. These were the highlands of a drowned kingdom, now surrounded by miles of salt water that grew wider with every passing generation. As the land bridges were severed, the communities living upon these islands found themselves in a strange and quiet isolation. The kinship networks that had spanned hundreds of miles, maintained by seasonal migrations and the sharing of stone tools, were suddenly cut short. A journey that once required only a sturdy pair of legs and a knowledge of the stars now required a vessel. The severance was absolute. Imagine the quiet realization of a group of people who, upon returning to a traditional summer hunting ground, found that the narrow strip of land they usually crossed had vanished beneath a permanent channel of churning water. The geography of their ancestors was being rewritten by the tide, and with each severed connection, a piece of their cultural memory drifted further away. The archaeology of this period, often studied through the lens of stratigraphy, the careful analysis of soil layers that act as a diary of the earth, shows a profound shift in how these people lived. In the deeper, older layers, we find the remains of land-based hunters, the bones of aurochs and red deer, and the delicate flint points used to bring them down. But as we move upward, through the sediment, into the layers that represent the thinning of the land, the story changes. The tools become different, the diet shifts. The people of the Doggerland archipelago were forced into a new way of being, a maritime survival that demanded a total reimagining of their relationship with the world. They became a people of the coast, even as the coast itself refused to stay still. The vast inland forests were replaced by tidal flats and salt marshes, rich with the smell of brine and decaying vegetation. Survival now depended on the rhythms of the moon and the tides rather than the seasonal migrations of the great herds. The spear was joined by the harpoon. The forest path was replaced by the dugout canoe. We find evidence of this transition in the submerged forests that occasionally emerge from the sand after a modern storm. Stumps of oak and pine, preserved in the anaerobic, oxygen-free mud of the seabed, standing like ghosts of a landscape that was once dry and vibrant. These trees didn't die of old age. They were choked by the rising salt, a silent testament to the moment the sea claimed the land. The isolation of these island communities meant that local cultures began to diverge. On one island, the fashioning of a flint blade might take on a specific, unique shape, while on another, just 20 miles away across a now impassable strait, a different tradition was forming. The shared language of the plains was breaking into dialects of the sea. There is a profound loneliness in this part of the story. The thought of small groups of humans, perhaps only a few dozen strong, living out their lives on a shrinking island, watching the distant blue haze where they knew other people once lived, but no longer able to reach them. They were the first inhabitants of a world defined by boundaries, by the hard edges of the water. Meanwhile, the very nature of the hunt was being transformed. The megafauna of the earlier Holocene, the giant deer and the heavy-set wild cattle, could not survive on the smaller islands. Their grazing lands were disappearing, replaced by reeds and salt-tolerant grasses. As these animals vanished, the humans turned their gaze toward the water. They learned the migrations of the grey seal and the spawning patterns of the salmon. They became experts in the ecology of the estuary. This shift from land-based hunting to maritime foraging wasn't just a change in diet. It was a fundamental shift in the human psyche. The horizon was no longer a place to be reached by walking. It was a boundary that could only be crossed by those who understood the temper of the waves. There is a specific kind of mystery in the Younger Dryas, a term geologists use to describe a brief, cold snap that occurred just before the final drowning. It was a moment when the warming world suddenly shivered and the glaciers briefly pushed back. But even this temporary reprieve could not stop the eventual rise of the oceans. Once the warmth returned, the melting accelerated. The archipelago of Doggerland became even more precarious. The islands grew smaller, the channels grew deeper, and the storms of the North Sea began to batter the low-lying shores with a new, terrifying intensity. The people of this era likely lived in a state of constant, slow-motion migration. Their campsites, once nestled in the center of vast valleys, were moved higher and higher up the slopes. We find their traces today not on the land, but in the nets of fishermen who trawled the Dogger Bank. They pull up worked flints, barbed points made of bone, and even the remains of human dwellings, all resting in the cold darkness of the seabed. These artifacts are messengers from a world that was being squeezed out of existence. Each piece of flint represents a moment of human ingenuity in the face of an encroaching infinite, a small, sharp defiance against the rising tide. As the years passed, the islands of the archipelago became too small to support permanent populations. The resources were stretched thin, and the fresh water springs were being contaminated by the sea. It is likely that during this time the final migrations began, the desperate journeys by boat toward the higher ground of what we now call England, the Netherlands, and Scandinavia. They were leaving behind a world that was literally dissolving beneath their feet. They were the first refugees of a changing climate, carrying with them the stories of a land that no longer existed, a land where once a person could walk from the hills of Yorkshire to the fjords of Norway without ever getting their feet wet. The formation of the archipelago was the penultimate chapter in the life of Doggerland. It was a time of transition, of narrowing horizons and deepening waters. The patient mystery of the sea had begun to claim its prize, turning a continent into a memory and a home into a myth. The land was being reclaimed by the deep, and the people who remained were the last witnesses to a geography that was being erased, one tide at a time, until only the highest peaks remained as lonely sentinels in the grey-blue expanse. The world was shrinking, and the sea was just beginning to show its true power, preparing for the final, sudden movements that would close the bridge forever. The sound of the end did not begin with a storm or a rising tide, but with a deep, subterranean groan, a vibration felt in the marrow of the bone rather than heard with the ear. Far to the north, off the rugged, icy coast of what we now call Norway, the continental shelf was under a pressure it could no longer sustain. Deep beneath the dark waters of the Norwegian Sea, a massive accumulation of glacial sediment, hundreds of miles of silt and clay deposited over millennia, reached its breaking point. This is the moment of the Storegga Slide, a name derived from the Norwegian for the Great Edge, and it remains one of the largest underwater landslides ever recorded in the history of our planet. In an instant of geologic violence, a stretch of the ocean floor the size of Scotland collapsed, sending 3,000 cubic kilometers of earth cascading into the abyss. The displacement of such an unimaginable volume of earth created a ripple that defies the modern imagination. It was not a single wave, but a series of pulses, a kinetic energy transferred from the cold depths to the surface of the North Sea. As this energy raced southward, it transformed into a tsunami, a wall of water moving with the speed of a jet engine across the open expanse. In the deep ocean, such a wave might be nearly invisible, a mere swell on the horizon, but as it approached the shallow, narrowing basin of Doggerland, the physics of the sea began to change. The water slowed down, and as it slowed, it grew taller. The energy had nowhere to go but up, reaching heights of 20 meters, nearly 65 feet, as it bore down on the low-lying plains where the last of the hunter-gatherers made their homes. Imagine the stillness of that morning on the fens of Doggerland. The air might have been crisp, smelling of salt and damp earth, with the calls of migratory birds echoing across the marshes. Perhaps the people were mending nets or preparing the morning meal, unaware that the horizon was beginning to change colour. To them, the sea had always been a slow thief, a presence that crept up the beaches over generations. They had no word for what was coming. The first sign would have been the water receding, a sudden and unnatural low tide that sucked the sea away from the shore, exposing the secrets of the seabed, the kelp forests, and the shivering fish left gasping in the mud. And then a silence, followed by a distant, low roar that grew into a deafening thunder. When the wave hit, it did not merely flood the land, it erased it. The lowlands of Doggerland offered no resistance, no cliffs to break the force, no high ground to provide sanctuary. The water surged inland for miles, travelling over the flat terrain with terrifying speed, snapping ancient oaks like dry twigs, and sweeping away entire seasonal camps in a heartbeat. The stratigraphy, that layering of soil and history that archaeologists use to read the past, shows a distinct, chaotic layer of sand and silt from this event, a messy signature of destruction that sits atop the peaceful peat of the old world. This layer tells a story of a day when the geography of Europe was rewritten in an afternoon. The immediate impact was catastrophic. Those who were not caught in the initial surge would have looked out across a landscape that had become unrecognizable. The freshwater lagoons were suddenly choked with salt and debris. The forests were drowned in brine, their leaves turning brown and brittle in the days that followed. The delicate ecosystem of the marshes, which provided the fish, the fowl, and the plant life that sustained human existence, was decimated in a single stroke. The Storegga Slide was not just a natural disaster, it was a severance. It was the moment the bridge between Britain and the continent was finally, irrevocably broken. As the years passed after the Great Wave, the water did not fully retreat. The tsunami had accelerated a process that was already well underway, pushing the sea over the final thresholds of the low-lying plains. What remained was no longer a vast territory, but a series of dwindling islands, the highest points of the old Dogger Hills now surrounded by a grey, restless sea. The people who survived were forced into a new reality, one where the horizon was always made of water. They became islanders, their ancestral hunting grounds lost to the depths, their stories beginning to drift into the realm of the tall tale and the half-remembered dream. We often wonder how much of our collective mythology is rooted in such moments of geological upheaval. Could the stories of lost lands, of cities beneath the waves, be the distant, muffled echoes of the Storegga Slide? The radiocarbon dating, a method of measuring the decay of carbon isotopes to determine the age of organic matter, places this event roughly 8,200 years ago. This is a span of time that feels vast, yet in the context of human history, it is only a few hundred generations. It is a blink of an eye in deep time, yet it is long enough for a landscape to be completely forgotten by the waking mind, surviving only in the sediment of the seafloor and the quietest corners of our imagination. The Storegga event serves as a reminder of the fragility of the world we inhabit. We tend to think of the earth as a solid, permanent stage upon which our history unfolds, but the story of Doggerland suggests otherwise. The earth is fluid, shifting, and prone to sudden, dramatic shifts that can discard entire civilizations as easily as a child knocks over a tower of blocks. The debris from the slide settled, the waters eventually calmed, but the world was quieter than it had been before. The bustling highways of the tundra were gone, the great herds of reindeer and horse had nowhere left to roam. In the aftermath, the silence must have been profound. The survivors would have looked out from the remaining ridges of the Dogger Bank, watching as the tides continued their patient work. The sea was no longer a neighbour. It was the master of the house. Every high tide brought the water a little further inland. Every winter storm carved away another piece of the soft, sandy soil. The people were living on a clock that was winding down. They were the inhabitants of a vanishing world, witnesses to a slow-motion apocalypse that had been punctuated by a single, terrifying scream from the deep. As we look back through the lens of modern science, we can map the contours of the slide and calculate the height of the waves, but we can never truly know the human cost. We cannot hear the cries of those caught in the surge, nor can we understand the grief of those who watched their entire world disappear beneath a wall of white foam. All that remains are the silent artifacts pulled up in fishing nets, the flint tools, the carved bone harpoons, the teeth of mammoths, each one a fragment of a life interrupted. The Storegga Slide was the final, violent act in the drama of Doggerland's submergence. It transformed a peninsula into an archipelago, and eventually those islands too would succumb to the rising tides. The land was being swallowed, not just by water, but by time itself. The memory of the walk from London to Copenhagen was fading, becoming a ghost story whispered around fires on the new coastlines of a fragmented Europe. The bridge was gone, the door was shut, and the deep, cold water of the North Sea began its long, lonely reign over the drowned world that lay beneath. The sound of the world changing was not a single violent roar, but a relentless, rhythmic pulse. The sound of waves claiming one more inch of shoreline every single day. As the 7th millennium before the Common Era drew to a close, the geography of the North was a fragile tapestry of salt marshes and shrinking lagoons. The great plains that once echoed with the migration of reindeer were now a memory held only by the oldest members of the dwindling tribes. What remained was a landscape of islands, a scattered archipelago, where the high ground of the Dogger Bank stood as a final, defiant sanctuary against the encroaching grey. But even this sanctuary was being undermined by the very element that had once provided its bounty. The North Sea and the Atlantic were no longer distant neighbours. They were closing in, seeking a point of contact, a place where their cold currents could finally meet and sever the umbilical cord of the European continent. The geography of this final era was defined by the Strait of Dover, or rather, the lack of it. For hundreds of thousands of years, a massive ridge of chalk and limestone had acted as a natural dam, a colossal land bridge connecting what we now call Kent to the coast of France. This was the wheeled Artois anticline, a ridge that stood as the last physical barrier protecting the lowlands of Doggerland from the full force of the English Channel. But time and the rising tides are patient sculptors. The water had been gnawing at this chalk for centuries, exploiting every fracture and every weakness in the stone. Around 6,000 years before the Common Era, the pressure became insurmountable. We can imagine the final breach not as a sudden cataclysm, but as a series of cascading failures. First, the high tides began to spill over the lowest points of the ridge, carving small gullies that grew wider with every passing moon. Then, perhaps during a season of particularly fierce storms, the barrier simply gave way. The English Channel and the North Sea rushed toward one another, their waters swirling together in a chaotic embrace that permanently rearranged the map of the world. In that moment, the peninsula of Britain died, and the island of Great Britain was born. The separation was absolute. The salt water rushed through the new breach with the force of 1,000 rivers, scouring the seabed and widening the gap until the white cliffs of Dover stood staring across a widening void at their twins on the French coast. To the people living on the hills of southern England, the world had suddenly become much smaller. The familiar paths to the south were gone, replaced by a churning, treacherous stretch of water that no foot could ever cross again. The isolation was not just physical, but cultural. The flow of ideas, of people, and of flint from the mainland was suddenly filtered through the lens of the sea. Meanwhile, further to the north, the last remnants of the Dogger Bank were fighting a losing battle. This high plateau, once the heart of a vast hunting ground, had become a lonely island, a place of refuge for the last of the Mesolithic hunters who still clung to the old ways. These were people of the water,
masters of the dugout canoe and the bone harpoon, but even their skill could not save them from the inevitability of the deep. The stratigraphy, which is simply the study of the layers of earth and rock that tell the story of time, shows us a clear and heartbreaking transition. In the soil of the North Sea floor, we see the dark, rich peat of the freshwater marshes suddenly overlaid by the fine grey silt of the ocean. It is a record of a world being smothered. As the years passed, the Dogger Bank grew smaller and smaller, its forests dying as salt water poisoned the roots of the oak and the hazel. The deer and the elk, trapped on a shrinking island with no escape, would have eventually vanished, leaving the human inhabitants with only the sea to provide for them. There is a profound mystery in these final years. Did the last families realize they were the end of a lineage? Did they watch the horizon every evening, seeing the familiar landmarks of their ancestors' stories slowly dip beneath the waves? The final inundation was likely accelerated by a phenomenon known as isostatic rebound.
As the massive weight of the northern ice sheets melted away, the Earth's crust began to tilt. While the north of Scotland rose, relieved of its icy burden, the southern parts of the North Sea basin began to sink, like a seesaw responding to a shifting weight. This subtle geological sinking meant that even if the sea levels had stopped rising, the land of Doggerland would still have been destined to disappear. It was being pulled down from below, even as it was being flooded from above. By approximately 5,800 BC, the Dogger Bank had likely been reduced to a series of treacherous shoals and sandbars, visible only at low tide. The drowned world was no longer a place where humans could walk or sleep. It had become a kingdom of shadows, a realm of cod and mackerel, where the silent ruins of ancient campsites were slowly buried under meters of shifting sand. The artifacts we find today, the barbed points, the polished stone axes, the delicate jewelry made of amber, are the only witnesses left to this slow-motion tragedy. They are pulled up in the nets of modern trawlers, sudden cold reminders of a life lived in a place that no longer exists on any modern map. The separation of Britain from the continent was more than just a change in borders. It was a shift in the very rhythm of human existence. The people who remained on the new island were now islanders, their lives dictated by the tides and the temper of the surrounding seas. The vast, open plains that had allowed for the easy movement of tribes were replaced by dense forests and rugged coastlines. The memory of the walk to Copenhagen, once a simple journey across a grassy meadow, became a myth, a story told to children about a time when the world was whole and the great white bears still roamed the southern marshes. We often think of history as a series of events recorded in books, but the history of Doggerland is recorded in the silence of the seabed. It is a history written in the absence of things, the absence of light, the absence of air, the absence of footsteps. When we look out over the grey waters of the North Sea today, it is difficult to fathom that beneath those cold waves lie the valleys where people once fell in love, the clearings where they built their fires, and the paths they took to visit their kin. The water is a veil, thick and impenetrable, hiding a landscape that was as vibrant and essential as any we know today. The final sinking of the Dogger Bank represents the closing of a chapter that lasted for hundreds of thousands of years. It was the end of the Great Plain of Europe, a loss of territory so vast that it fundamentally altered the course of human development in the West. As the last bit of dry land slipped beneath the surface, the North Sea achieved its modern form, a cold and restless body of water that would go on to shape the destinies of Vikings, traders, and empires. But beneath the keels of their ships, the old world remained, preserved in the cold anaerobic mud, waiting for a time when we would have the technology and the curiosity to look down into the dark and remember. As the waves finally closed over the highest peak of the bank, the silence must have been profound. There was no one left to witness the final transition, no one to see the last tuft of grass disappear or the last bird lose its nesting ground. The transition from land to sea was complete. The bridge was broken, the door was locked, and the deep time of the ocean had claimed its prize. The drowned world of Doggerland had transitioned from a physical reality into a ghost of the geological record, a haunting reminder of how fragile our foothold on this earth truly is. For thousands of years, the North Sea held its secrets behind a veil of grey water and shifting silt, a silent guardian of a world that once was. But the silence of the deep is no longer absolute. In recent decades, a new kind of archaeology has emerged, one that does not require a shovel or a brush, but rather the cold, precise tools of the digital age. We are beginning to see through the waves, peeling back the layers of the ocean floor to reveal the undulating hills and winding river valleys that have been hidden since the Mesolithic. This rediscovery did not begin in a museum or a dusty university archive, but in the unlikely offices of the energy industry. As oil and gas companies spent decades scanning the seabed of the North Sea, they used a technology known as seismic reflection. By sending sound waves deep into the earth and recording how they bounced back off the different layers of rock and sediment, they created vast maps of the subterranean world. To the engineers, these maps were a guide to the fossil fuels buried miles beneath the crust. But to a small group of visionary researchers, the most interesting part of the data was the very top layer, the thin skin of the seabed that the oil companies usually ignored. Within those first few meters of sediment lay the ghost of Doggerland, preserved in the fine-grained silts and sands of the post-glacial world. The work of bringing this ghost back to life fell to the pioneers of the Lost Frontiers project at the University of Bradford, led by Professor Vincent Gaffney and a team of dedicated specialists. They realized that the seismic data provided by companies like Petroleum Geoservices held the key to reconstructing an entire continent. Using advanced three-dimensional modeling software, they began to stitch together thousands of square miles of survey data, turning raw numbers into a visual landscape. It is a slow, meticulous process, akin to assembling a jigsaw puzzle where most of the pieces are invisible. Yet, as the processing power of our computers grew, the image began to sharpen. Imagine standing before a monitor as a digital ocean is drained away, second by second. First, the flat, featureless blue of the water disappears. Then, the modern seabed, scarred by trawler nets and telecommunication cables, is stripped back. What remains is a paleo-landscape, a term archaeologists use to describe an ancient environment frozen in time. Suddenly, the screen is filled with the unmistakable shapes of geography. We see the meandering path of the Great Ouse as it once flowed hundreds of miles further than it does today. We see the contours of the outer Silver Pit, not as a deep water depression, but as a massive lake, perhaps surrounded by reed beds and the constant chatter of waterfowl. These three-dimensional models allow us to walk through Doggerland in a way that would have been unthinkable just a generation ago. We can trace the ridgelines where hunters might have stood to watch for the migration of red deer. We can identify the sheltered valleys that would have provided a reprieve from the biting winds of the North Sea basin. This is geophysics, as a form of time travel, a way to reclaim a lost heritage from the crushing weight of the Atlantic. The researchers at Bradford are not just finding sites, they are reconstructing an entire ecological system. They can see where the marshes gave way to birch forests and where the rising tides would have first begun to turn freshwater lagoons into salty marshes. The complexity of this work is staggering. The team must account for the way the Earth itself has moved over the millennia, a process called isostatic rebound. As the massive weight of the ice sheets melted away, the land beneath them began to rise, while the land further south, including parts of Doggerland, began to tilt and sink. By factoring these geological shifts into their models, the scientists can create a chronological map showing exactly how the coastline changed century by century. It is a fluid, breathing history, a reminder that the Earth is never truly static, but a restless, shifting entity that breathes in cycles of ice and fire. And yet, for all the precision of the seismic data, there is still a profound sense of mystery. The models can show us where a river once ran, but they cannot show us the faces of the people who fished there. They can highlight a prominent hill, but they cannot tell us the stories or the myths that the inhabitants attach to that landmark. We are looking at a stage without the actors, a beautifully rendered theatre where the play has long since ended. The seismic waves can map the stratigraphy, the different layers of soil and rock deposited over time, but they cannot capture the smell of wood smoke or the sound of a flint blade being knapped against a stone. This gap between the digital and the physical is where the true labour of the Lost Frontiers project lies. To bridge it, they combine their three-dimensional maps with physical samples taken from the seabed. Using massive research vessels, they drop hollow tubes into the ocean floor to extract core samples, long cylinders of mud and peat that serve as a vertical timeline of the past. When these cores are brought to the surface, they are sliced open in a laboratory, revealing a dark, compressed history of the drowned world. Within these layers of peat, scientists find microscopic clues, ancient pollen grains, the wings of beetles, and even the DNA of plants and animals that lived there 10,000 years ago. By matching the pollen found in a specific core to a specific location on their three-dimensional map, the researchers can re-green the digital landscape. They can say with certainty that this particular valley was thick with hazel and oak, or that this high plateau was a desolate expanse of tundra moss. This synthesis of geophysics and biology is creating the most detailed portrait of a prehistoric landscape ever attempted. It is a testament to human ingenuity that we can now map a world we can never visit, using the echoes of sound waves to illuminate the darkness of the deep. As we look at these maps, we are forced to confront the sheer scale of what was lost. Doggerland was not a small island or a temporary land bridge. It was the heart of Europe. It was a vast, fertile plain that connected what are now disparate nations into a single contiguous territory. The work at Bradford University reminds us that the geography we take for granted, the cliffs of Dover, the fjords of Norway, the beaches of the Netherlands, are merely the ragged edges of a much larger story. We are living on the high ground of a sunken continent, the survivors of a slow-motion cataclysm that reshaped the face of our world. There is a quiet dignity in this scientific pursuit, a refusal to let the past be forgotten simply because it is out of reach. Each new survey, each refined model, brings us closer to understanding the lives of those who came before us. We see the paths they might have walked and the vistas they would have known. And while the North Sea continues to roll over the bones of Doggerland, its power to hide the truth is waning. Through the lens of modern technology, the drowned world is rising once more, not as a physical landmass, but as a vivid, shimmering map of our shared human journey. We are finally learning to read the language of the stones and the silt, listening to the long-delayed echoes of a world that was once our home. The story of this lost world is not merely a tale of rising tides and shifting sands, but a silent history written into the very marrow of those who live in northern Europe today. As the waters of the North Sea claimed the plains and the valleys, the people did not simply vanish. They moved, carrying with them the biological blueprints of a landscape that no longer exists. Geneticists, peering into the deep code of human DNA, have begun to trace the ghost trails of these ancient migrations. They find that the inhabitants of the British Isles, the Low Countries, and Scandinavia share a profound ancestral connection that predates the rise of kings and the building of cities. This genetic tapestry was woven in the marshes and forests of Doggerland, where disparate groups of hunter-gatherers met, traded, and merged over thousands of years. When the sea eventually forced them to higher ground, they took the memory of that drowned world with them, locked within their cells, a quiet legacy that survives even now in the colour of an eye or the shape of a jawline. It is a strange and humbling thought to realise that the people walking the busy streets of modern London or the quiet quays of Copenhagen are the living descendants of a vast, central heartland that is now entirely underwater. Our blood carries the rhythm of a land that has been silent for 8 millennia. We are, in a sense, the children of the flood, shaped by a catastrophe so slow and so absolute that it redefined the boundaries of our world. While the physical evidence of Doggerland was lost to the depths, something of its essence seems to have drifted into the mist of our collective imagination. Across the coastal regions of the North Sea, the folklore is heavy with the scent of salt and the sorrow of lost things. There are countless tales of bells ringing from drowned steeples during a storm, or of fishermen seeing the white walls of sunken cities shimmering beneath the waves on a clear, calm day. In the Netherlands, they tell of the city of Saeftinghe, swallowed by the sea. In Wales, it is the kingdom of Cantre'r Gwaelod, protected by dikes until a moment of negligence let the ocean in. These stories are often dismissed as mere myth or the product of overactive imaginations, yet they echo a fundamental truth that our ancestors knew all too well. They speak to a time when the horizon was not a fixed line, and the earth beneath one's feet was not guaranteed to remain dry. Perhaps these legends are the fragmented remains of a cultural memory, a faint, distorted signal from a time when the geography of the world was in a state of constant, terrifying flux. As the centuries stretched into millennia, the specific names of the valleys and the rivers of Doggerland were forgotten, but the feeling of the loss remained. It manifests as a lingering sense of melancholy that often haunts the literature and art of the North, a preoccupation with the transience of human endeavour and the overwhelming power of the natural world. We see it in the Anglo-Saxon poems that speak of the ruin, where the works of giants are broken by the passage of time, and we see it in the modern fascination with ruins and abandoned places. Doggerland serves as the ultimate ruin, a vast monument to the fragility of our human geography. It reminds us that the maps we draw with such confidence are merely temporary sketches on a canvas that is always being repainted. Consider for a moment the sheer scale of what was lost. This was not a small island or a single coastal village, but a territory larger than many modern nations. It contained ecosystems that supported millions of birds, herds of deer and red deer, and the great aurochs, the massive wild cattle that once thundered across the plains. There were rivers as grand as the Rhine and the Thames, flowing through valleys that are now deep-sea trenches. To think of Doggerland is to confront the limits of our own permanence. We build our cities of stone and steel, believing them to be eternal, yet the history of the North Sea tells us that even the greatest landscapes can be erased. The silt and the sand do not care for our borders or our monuments. They follow the slow, heavy pulse of the climate and the tides. In the cold, dark reaches of the seabed, the artifacts of this lost world rest in a state of suspended animation. A flint tool, carefully knapped by a steady hand 10,000 years ago, lies undisturbed beside the rib of a mammoth. A piece of worked amber, perhaps once worn as a protective charm, waits in the darkness, its golden glow extinguished by the weight of the water. These objects are the punctuation marks in a long, silent sentence. They tell of a life that was intimate and demanding, where every day was a negotiation with the elements. The people of Doggerland were not primitive in the sense of being simple. They were masters of a complex and changing environment. They understood the migration of the eels and the ripening of the hazelnuts. They knew which stars marked the coming of the frost and how to read the language of the wind. As we peer back through the stratigraphy, that layering of soil and time that archaeologists use to read the earth, we find that the story of Doggerland is one of incredible resilience. For thousands of years, the inhabitants adapted. When the marshes grew too wet, they moved to the ridges. When the forests retreated, they followed the game. It was only at the very end, when the Storegga Slide sent a wall of water racing across the plains, that the story reached its final, abrupt conclusion. That event, a massive underwater landslide off the coast of Norway some 8,200 years ago, likely acted as the final blow, a sudden and violent end to a process that had been unfolding for generations. This realization brings a certain weight to our understanding of the present. We live in an age where we are once again aware of the shifting of the seas and the warming of the atmosphere. Doggerland is no longer just a curiosity for geologists. It is a mirror. It shows us what happens when the delicate balance of the planet tips. It reveals that the solid Earth is a fluid thing, and that the places we call home are held in a fragile embrace by the oceans. The drowned world is a reminder that we are guests on this planet, living in the brief intervals between the great movements of the Earth's cycles. And so, we look out over the grey waters of the North Sea with a newfound sense of reverence. Beneath those waves, there is a silence that is not empty, but full of the echoes of 1,000,000 lives. The fishermen who still occasionally pull up a fragment of bone or a piece of ancient wood are touching the hem of a ghost. They are the unwitting curators of a museum that spans thousands of square miles, a gallery of the lost that requires no lights and has no walls. The legacy of Doggerland is found in the way we now look at the horizon, wondering what else lies hidden beneath the blue. What other chapters of our history have been folded away by the tides, waiting for a time when we are quiet enough to hear them? The mystery of the lost land persists, not because we lack the data, but because the scale of it is so difficult for the human mind to truly grasp. We are used to thinking in years and decades, perhaps centuries, but Doggerland requires us to think in millennia. It asks us to imagine a world where the English Channel was a wide, fertile valley, and where one could walk from the site of modern-day Hull to the coast of Denmark without ever getting their feet wet. It is a landscape of the mind as much as it is a landscape of the past. As the darkness of the deep sea continues to guard its secrets, we are left with the profound beauty of the unknown. The knowledge that beneath the familiar world we navigate every day, there are layers of existence that we are only just beginning to name. The stones and the silt continue their long, slow conversation, shielded from the sun and the air, and while we may never truly know the names of the people who watched the last sunrise over the plains of Doggerland, we carry their journey within us. Their struggle, their adaptation, and their eventual departure are the foundational myths of our modern world. As we drift toward the conclusion of this journey through the drowned past, the weight of those forgotten ages feels less like a burden and more like a bridge, a connection to a time when the world was vast, wild, and unified by the simple act of walking across the earth. The North Sea is not a void, but a heavy, liquid veil, pulled tight over a landscape that still remembers the touch of the wind. Beneath the rhythmic pulse of the modern tides, where the great container ships trace invisible lines across the surface, there exists a profound and absolute silence. It is a stillness that has endured for 8,000 years, a quiet so deep that it seems to hold its breath. Down in the dim, emerald twilight of the seabed, the plains of Doggerland lie in a state of perpetual rest. There are no more storms here, no more seasonal migrations of reindeer, no more smoke rising from hearths to meet the grey northern sky. There is only the slow, rhythmic settling of silt, a fine dusting of time that covers the valleys and the ridges like a shroud of soft velvet. As we linger in this underwater world, we might visualize the geography as it once was, stripped of the crushing weight of the salt water. Imagine the great wandering path of the Rhine, winding its way through wide, grassy basins, its waters clear and cold. Imagine the massive stands of oak and hazel that once crowned the hills, their roots now petrified or dissolved into the dark peat. This is a world of soft contours and gentle slopes, a territory where a traveller could once walk for days without ever seeing the sea, surrounded by the rustle of tall grasses and the distant call of waterfowl. It was a kingdom of the horizon, where the earth felt eternal and the land seemed to stretch on forever into the mist. The transition from that vibrant, living world to this submerged memory was not a single violent event, but a long, slow surrender to the rising blue. We think of the North Sea as a permanent fixture of our maps, but in the eyes of the earth it is a recent arrival, a guest that moved in and never left. The stratigraphy, the layers of mud and sand that geologists study like the pages of a book, tells a story of gradual erasure. First, the low-lying marshes became salt flats. Then, the salt flats became lagoons. Finally, the lagoons opened up to the hungry reach of the ocean until the hills became islands and the islands became shoals, and the shoals finally vanished beneath the whitecaps. Now, the only inhabitants are the creatures of the deep. Crabs scuttle over the places where children once played, and schools of silverfish dart through the spaces where hunters once shared stories around a fire. The rivers that once nourished a continent are now merely depressions in the sand, filled with the debris of the ages. Yet, there is a strange comfort in this preservation. The cold, oxygen-poor environment of the seabed acts as a vault, keeping the secrets of the Mesolithic era safe from the ravages of the air. The flint tools, the carved antler harpoons, and even the delicate wooden paddles are cradled in the silt, waiting in a state of suspended animation. They are the physical echoes of a people who did not know they were living on the edge of a disappearing world. It is humbling to consider the deep time of the earth, those vast stretches of history that dwarf our modern civilizations. We often view our current geography as the final, finished version of the world, but Doggerland reminds us that the map is always being redrawn. The earth breathes in long, slow cycles of ice and warmth, of rising and falling. We are currently living in a brief window of stability, a pause in a much larger story that began long before the first spear was knapped and will continue long after our own cities have faded into the soil. To think of Doggerland is to embrace a sense of patient mystery. It asks us to look at the waves and see not just water, but a hidden country. It invites us to wonder about the thousands of generations whose names have been washed away, but whose footsteps paved the way for our own. Theirs was a world without borders, a world defined by the migration of the sun and the movement of the herds. They lived in harmony with a landscape that was constantly shifting beneath their feet, showing a resilience that is woven into the very fabric of our DNA. As the night deepens and the world around you grows still, let your mind drift like a piece of driftwood on those ancient tides. Feel the weight of the ages settling around you, as soft and light as the silt on the floor of the North Sea. There is no need to hurry, no need to seek answers in the dark. The plains are quiet now, the forests are at peace, the great rivers have found their rest. The story of the drowned world is not a tragedy, but a testament to the enduring spirit of the earth. It is a reminder that even when the land vanishes, the essence of the journey remains. We are all travelers on a changing planet, walking across bridges that may one day be covered by the sea, leaving behind traces that will eventually be gathered by the deep. Let the image of the underwater plains bring a sense of profound calm. Visualize the slow sway of the kelp in the current, like trees moving in a slow-motion wind. See the light from the surface filtering down in long, shimmering rays, turning the seabed into a cathedral of jade and shadow. Everything is muffled. Everything is steady. The frantic pace of the modern world cannot reach this depth. Here, time is measured in millennia, and the only clock is the slow accumulation of the sand. As you drift toward sleep, carry with you the knowledge that the earth holds us all in its long memory. Whether we walk on dry land or rest beneath the waves, we are part of a continuous, unbroken chain of life that stretches back into the heart of the deep time. The ancestors of Doggerland have finished their long walk, and now they invite you to find your own stillness. The water is cool and dark, the silt is soft, the silence is absolute. Sink down into the quiet beauty of the past, leaving the worries of the present to float away like bubbles toward the surface. The world is vast, the history is deep, and the rest is well earned. Close your eyes now and imagine the last of the mist clearing over a wide, grassy plain that no longer exists. Hear the faint, ghostly rustle of the wind in the reeds, a sound that has been preserved in the heart of the ocean. It is a lullaby from a forgotten age, a song of the earth before the islands were divided. Rest in that unity, rest in that ancient peace. The journey is complete, and the drowned world is at rest. The plains are silent, the rivers are still. The deep time of the earth is holding you now, as it has held the secrets of Doggerland for 8,000 years. Sleep in the quiet, sleep in the deep, sleep in the knowledge that you are home.